Welcome, welcome. My name is Nora O Murchú. I'm a curator and a researcher, and I'm very pleased to be here, both to be in conversation with Margarida and Arkadi, whose practices in very different ways examine how borders, infrastructures, and systems shape contemporary life. First of all, I'm going to do a little short bio intro, just in case you haven't read the booklet. It's always good to remind people where we are, who we're with. So Margarida Mendes is a researcher, artist, curator, and educator whose work focuses on ecological mediation, environmental sensing, and sonic ecologies. Through long-term fieldwork and research, her practice explores how environments register industrialization, extraction, militarization, and ecological transformation through sound, vibration, atmosphere, and forms of interspecies relation. Now, to my left, Arkadi Zaides, is that correct? Zaides, excuse me, is a choreographer, performer, and researcher whose work explores the relationship between bodies, political violence, and system of control. Across projects such as Telos, Archive, and Necropolis, he examines how borders, surveillance technologies, and state violence becomes embodied, choreographed, and socially reproduced through movement, gesture, and spectatorship. You can also catch his performance tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. in the Teatro Circle. I think there's still some tickets left as well. So I guess while preparing for this conversation, I found myself thinking a lot about the relationship between borders, environments, and systems of perception, and how both of your works actually approach those questions from very different but very actually surprisingly kind of connected directions. And what connects both of your work for me is an attention to how infrastructures, systems shape bodies and atmospheres, and how violence is experienced, not only politically, but actually spatially, environmentally, and actually sensorially as well. And I feel that both of your works approach borders not just as simply like lines on maps, but actually as systems that organize movement, perception, behavior, and coexistence. Borders today do not only stop movement at a line, they increasingly anticipate, classify, and model movement before it happens, turning bodies, behaviors, routes, and association into objects of prediction. I come from Ireland, and in particular, I think a lot about Northern Ireland, especially in relation to this conversation that we're about to have. And I'm very aware as an Irish person that borders do not disappear once checkpoints or military infrastructure are actually removed. The border in Ireland today is a colonial hangover of centuries of British rule and conflict. And even after the Good Friday Agreement softened the actual physical border, other forms of partition remain embedded socially and spatially. Inside cities like Derry and Belfast, borders are actually continually redrawn through flags, neighbourhoods, routes, curbstones, murals, architecture, and inherited forms of territorial behaviour. And in the north of Ireland, borders are learned bodily. You learn where you can move freely as a Catholic or a Protestant, as an Irish or as British, where you're watched, where you're unwelcome, what symbols to read, which pub to enter, and which road to avoid. And the border becomes less like a line than an atmosphere and a learned condition of movement. And this is something that I think resonates strongly across both of your works. In Margarida's work, borders emerge environmentally and ecologically. And in Telos, the border appears through surveillance, prediction, choreography, and technical management. So the conversation today will move through a series of themes around infrastructures and systems, choreography and listening, not only as physical barriers, but as technical, environmental, and perceptual systems that shape how bodies move and how environments relate, how forms of fear, belonging, and visibility are actually reproduced. So today we're here in conversation with one another for about an hour. And to begin with, what we'll do is we'll hear both from Margarida and Arkadi. They're going to give a short introduction to their projects, and followed by a conversation around kind of 40 minutes or so. And towards the end, we'll open up the floor for some conversations or some questions from the audience. So with that, I would like to now be quiet for most of our conversation. And I'd like to invite Margarida to begin with a brief introduction to her work. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here at Index after many years wanting to be on stage and sharing part of my practice. So I think the piece I'm going to be sharing here upon an invitation by Luís, it's research I did in the Biauveja forest, and it's called Labyrinths of Intermixing. It was commissioned by Times Network, a network of some sound festivals across Europe. So for those that don't know, the Białowieża forest is located in eastern Poland, in the border with Belarus, and it has 141 hectares of protected land. It is a transboundary ecosystem, and as such has very specific conditions that have been developing through time. This is a forest that was formed more or less 10,000 years ago after the last glaciation, and it's known as a primeval forest. What does that mean? That it does have an ecosystem which is composite of many, many layers of biodiversity, including also dead trees that have been there for a long, long time. But the sustenance of this kind of microclimate and the composite soil surrounding these dead trees actually has a microbiology that allows for a lot of species to emerge. Not only that it has different ecosystems within the Białowieża itself, including different sorts of wetlands, which are also considered part of ecotones. Ecotones are areas where different ecosystems meet and are often biodiversity hotspots where a lot of species evolve fairly quickly. So I was invited to think about this forest departing from a sound piece from Chris Watson and Isabella Duzit, field recorders who spent some time in residence at the Białowieża recording by leaving their microphones overnight and doing kind of sound walks into the forest, being guided into the sound composition that expands from late afternoon until the dawn chorus of birds in early morning. So it's a sound pitch that travels kind of in time into the forest. And after having recorded a lot of sound in different kind of jungles myself, I'm very interested in this kind of the temporal arc of sound and how sound can work as a sonic compass, locating us in space-time. So I've also been doing some work on deep time and on thinking about ecology, not just from our present moment, but thinking through scale, so looking back and speculatively thinking towards the future. And my sonic practice is more focused not only on toxicity, but also on thinking about the transtemporal changes of ecosystems. So I think a little bit upon a sound in this work as a navigational space, a kind of cartography within this vast forest, where mating calls have evolved and adapted to changing ecosystems, and they echo the transformations of forests in deep time. So when we're listening to a dawn chorus in the morning, we're listening to frequencies that arrive to us, but they also have adapted to the changes of the trees and of the landscape through time. So in a way, they portray sound in deep time of this relation of the elements that are there and those that have perished and that they have adapted to. So the Białowieża has been preserved since many, many years. It was a hunting kind of reserve in the 1400s. Became a national park in 1932 and a UNESCO protected area in 1979. And it has, of course, ongoing problems like any ecosystem, being that logging has really affected Białowieża since the Russian Empire, but also in the First World War, and more recently in 2017 when the Polish Prime Minister really had a project of extreme logging, which was contested by a lot of activists. But being a transboundary ecosystem, it is also very impacted by the rising militarization of Europe and armed conflicts in the world that have, forced a lot of different kind of migrations and routes for refugees. So this has become an important route for refugee crossing from Belarus to Poland, who have been trying to escape. And due to this fact, an electronic fence and a huge border of 186 kilometers has been built with 5 meters high, which has been electrified with cameras, motion detecting cameras, and different sorts of sensors. And Frontex Operational Agency, which is backed up by European Union, has been practicing a practice of pushback of refugees. So actually sending them back, unfortunately using direct violence, which as reported very recently in reports that I've read, with 120,000 pushback practices, leading sometimes and very painfully to share with the disappearance of several refugees. So the Białowieża is haunted by many forms of displacement, migration, the different kind of spatters of politics and of militarization that are rising in Europe recently. Around the border, there is a buffer zone, so it's like an extended perimeter, which is guarded by militia, actually. And this buffer zone is where sometimes activists or humanitarian people try to go and help refugees. So the whole rising militarization of Europe has actually led to a huge divestment in conservation and to, daunting human casualties, and of course, to ecosystem partition, which is one of the reasons I've been studying over the last years. And ecosystem partition is, I don't have an image, but it's quite notable how it's changing in the Białowieża, which has been this kind of wild forest for really long. As soon as you split an ecosystem, you don't have species migration. So the kind of evolution of life systems really changes. So it's unfolded in a big ecosystem transformation through time. So what does a border do to a forest? And what is the carbon footprint of militarization? What are its impacts on ecosystems and soundscapes? So in my work, I've been looking at different forms of sonic partition. I've been working on ocean noise and also on riverine ecologies, toxic ecologies in the Tejo River in Portugal, Mississippi, and other bodies of water. And I've been trying to develop what I later understood it was an abolitionist sonic practice, working against the partition of natural systems and really destabilizing how we think about ecology, working about sensory dispossession across different species and modes of life. So I've been focusing on not only what we can hear, but also what is unheard, also the space of unsound in the ecological equation. What lies outside sometimes the audible spectrum, out of sight, and the voices of the missing, who sometimes cannot even claim for accountability. So how can we analyze present soundscapes in deep time is something that I've been thinking about. Sound leaves ineffable traces, registering power relations in environments, sometimes much before they're fully expressed as symptoms and registered in the ecological strata. But sound already registers these power relations ongoing. So I've been doing a speculative practice around deep time sounding, from recording to playing back to writing about it to teaching. And I discovered I was doing a sort of transtemporal acoustomology, like a practice of knowing through sound that thinks through time, which is also really focused on the role of sonic witnessing. So I try to reflect on sound as a biological marker in deep time that allows us to read ecosystems differently, focusing on relations that are present, but also not fully legible. But let's go back to the forest and the dawn chorus. Acoustician Bernie Krause, some of you might know if you work in sound, speaks of the niche hypothesis, which is an hypothesis that says that in mature ecosystems, so complex ecosystems that have existed for a while, species have adapted, and they actually sing at unique bandwidths and pitches at different times, allowing each other to sound. So a dawn chorus in the Białowieża, which has many, many, many species, is actually super, super complex. And these species have adapted with an intelligent adaptation to bandwidth and frequency. So they allow themselves to an intermixing. So if the planetary chorality of species have the capacity to reinvent themselves sonically and find common spaces of inhabitation, why can't humans allow themselves to live in a world beyond borders and be wide open to the living labyrinths of intermixing? So I'm going to unfold some of this in the questions. I'm going to open it up later. Thank you for listening.
Hello. Good afternoon. Yeah, as Nora mentioned already, I'm a choreographer, performer, and researcher. I think my geographical trajectory, personal trajectory through migration also I have to unfold it a little bit in order to make clear from where I speak. So I was actually born not so far of the place that you describe. I was born in Belarus on the border with Ukraine, and specifically very close to Chernobyl, 1 hour and a half from Chernobyl, car ride. You know, the movement of toxicity is very much, you know, embodied in this body, and I think also marked my trajectory and also the somehow alertness or sensitivity I have to the body and how the body is operating and affected by different systems. Then I moved to Israel-Palestine, another not so easy, to say the least, context, where I lived and worked for around 25 years, and then I moved to Europe. I worked, slowly my work moved towards what I call documentary choreography. So documentary theater exists for, or at least the term exists for 100 years, but I was starting to question how actually choreography can be a tool of investigation or intervention into different social and political contexts. Living in Israel-Palestine, of course, this drew me to respond to what is happening there. I have created several works, working with, collaborating with Palestinian artists and Israeli artists, which was somehow perceived very well by the Israeli authorities, but at a certain moment when I started to invoke actually documents from the system of occupation, this became a bit less welcomed. In documentary choreography, what I'm trying to do is actually to start a choreographic process from a document. And specifically in that work that I mentioned that was not really well perceived, I used materials from B'Tselem. Maybe some of you know it's a human rights organization, Israeli human rights organization operating in the West Bank, which one of the projects that they did was distributing cameras to Palestinians in the most conflictual areas around the West Bank in order to give Palestinians the tool to bring evidence to violations that are happening on a daily basis. And this is the documents that I've been working with, and specifically choosing on stage to embody the gestures and postures of settlers and Israeli soldiers as an Israeli, and also questioning what do we do collectively. And I think, in a sense, the ending scene of that piece is also somehow oracles the genocide that is going on at the moment. I then faced different forms of censorship due to this work and decided to relocate to Europe at the moment where the so-called migration crisis, or some others call it crisis for migrants, was unfolding, so around 2015. And naturally, busy with the Israeli-Palestinian daily shifting border, I found myself in another border that was going through a massive transformation. So while the borders Europe concept was collapsing in front of our eyes, I decided to shift my gaze into the new territory which I find myself, the European territory, and started to question, the border apparatuses and actually the choreographies that are happening at these borders. I must add the deadly choreographers that are happening on these borders. So the first project that I did was Talos, which I will present tomorrow, and I will skip it and then come back to it. And the second project, which specifically addresses the situation that you have mentioned, is a project called Necropolis, which starting point is a list that is produced by a network of organizations which tries to accumulate all the information about people who are dying at the borders of Europe. So it's a list that until 2013, the official start of the migration crisis, from 1993 to till 2013. So for the 21st years of this list of the counting, this list had information about 3,000 people. And now, 12 years later, so the last third of the work of this organization, we are close to 70,000 people that are mentioned, which is partial. It's a partial number, and it just touches upon what you describe. And in that work, we actually confronted ourselves with the systematic dehumanization and anonymization that people that are dying at the borders of Europe are going through, not only through the deadly apparatuses that Europe put in place, like the one that Frontex put in place, but also through not giving access or not allowing access for forensic or not obliging the forensic system to actually look for identification of people. So it actually makes It actually makes a situation where 99% of the people that are mentioned in the list that we are working with have no name mentioned. And so before in Acropolis, so before the addressing somehow the outcomes of Europe's border fortification, I was busy with this project, Talos, which is a real project that existed within the research funding of the European Commission in the field of securitization, which was about speculating or testing the possibility to install semi-autonomous land drones at the borders of Europe to monitor the borders of Europe. So not the drones that we already know that have been already implemented, but they really imagined physical objects that would move and detect people on the ground. And naturally, coming from choreography, this potential encounter between human and non-humans at the border area became a kind of a point of interest because it's a specific type of choreography that actually the designers of this kind of systems had to imagine. And I wanted to share with you one image which somehow determined the form that we chose for this eventual performance. And this is actually after the 4 years of the work on this project of Talos, the original Talos, this was an event that was actually that took place in Poland, in Wrocław, with agents of Frontex and different border guard units from different countries in order to present the outcomes of the project. And what to draw our attention specifically in that image that the dispositive that they chose to present this project, and we can see, we see a stage basically, and coming from a stage, this was kind of, an important point to start to think how actually this dispositive, the dispositive of the theater, is being used in order to promote different, technologies of weapon and different types of violence. So I'll keep it there and we'll discuss further.
I guess let's get into it. I suppose I wanted to, first of all, thank you both for the introduction to your work. I guess I kind of wanted to start a little bit more about kind of this idea of like a borders infrastructure and how borders themselves actually these systems, they change in the way that bodies, environments, and forms of movement that they are altering these things. And I guess it may be a more simple, like direct way of asking these questions is like, how do you see that people or even animals, in your case, or even little insects, are actually like learning borders bodily? And maybe you could like speak a little bit about that in terms of kind of your choreographic work in relation to Talos, and then also maybe your idea of like the intervention of military into these kind of ecological spaces as well.
Well, it's working? Yeah, I guess one important thing to think, and I didn't speak about, the species of the Bioveja. It's very known for its bison population of 800 these days, for example, and different kind of bird species that are endemic there. But also reptiles. So I think something which is important when we think about ecosystem partition and this the deterring of migration of any sort of mode of life is that it actually changes the whole food chain and the whole pathogen chain. So if you once had kind of immunological responses, predatorial responses that counted with certain interactions, as soon as you block certain ways of, communication or of migration, the whole kind of immunological trace, the whole kind of biodiversity chain is changing. So the border might be a line, kind of, a thread if you see it on Google Maps, but the extension of the border or bordering effect is actually multiscalar. So I think we have to think about this kind of multiscalar impacts, across all sorts of species, not humans alone, and how it impacts the cycles of life, in a transborder effect, even European effect. This is completely unstudied these days. So yeah, I think ecosystem partition is something should be really spoken about, and has to be kind of a policy rationale for bordering systems that has to be, dismantled much deeply.
Maybe you want me to ask again?
Yes.
Remind you? I asked you about for example, why the way the human movement becomes translated into data and behavioral patterns, and how kind of through your practice, choreography becomes kind of mean to turn something that maybe feels like policy or abstract into something that becomes like it comes into something other than documentary practice.
Yeah, so, about the experience of a border, I think for me, I always think about a quote of Agar Kotef, who is Israeli political scientist, who somehow mentioned that we are in a moment, or we have been always in a moment where there is a certain acceleration of movement of some, and the targeting of movement for others, so their own movement is being targeted continuously. So I'm always thinking about these two vectors, and we can see it in in technology, in the technological development, how in border apparatuses, in the passports we're carrying, in the and not interestingly, but horrifically enough, when working with the list of United, you understand you have to collapse this idea of a border as we perceive it, because when you read into the list of United and into the thousands of deaths that are happening at the borders of Europe, and I'm deliberately doing like this. Because when you read into it, you understand that actually border follow people, asylum seekers, migrants who try to traverse this territory and actually dying everywhere. So actually, the border chases. It doesn't remain at its for some of us, defined somehow barrier. And for me, it's interesting also to think about what does it mean for the body. You know, how can it operate? I'm also thinking about the work of Shaham Khosavri, who is an Iranian sociologist who did, you know, a whole book about the idea of waiting, and specifically thinking about the waiting. And I'm thinking, embodying this, you know, this notion of what does it mean that a person needs to wait for papers for 20 years. And I'm working with some of these people that are waiting for 20 years. What does it mean to be on a hold of many aspects of your life because you don't have this fucking paper? So it's, I think the technologies are you know, intruding the body on so many levels, and for some it is just, you know, the small fingerprint that we had to check in while crossing, you know, coming from vacation, and some, you know, cannot even get closer to this point because they are in danger to being deported.
Yeah, and I think that connects quite nicely actually to your work, because you talk a lot about kind of like how bodies carry like the effects of borders environmentally. So maybe you have like a comment.
It's a different question. But when I was speculating about it when you first mentioned it, I had this kind of abstract thought. And my first thought was, if we somehow perceive what's around us, you know, as this kind of extensive world or universe around us, and something is abducted from us, you know, or the possibility of going to a space or to walk into that space, could it be that we have a phantom limb of the impossibility of reaching that space? So what would be this kind of ecosystemic phantom limb, you know? If you know that something or some space, some relations with some species or some ecosystem or a territory has been abducted from you. So how do we deal with this kind of phantom limb? What kind of ghost body memory is there from this unproductive relation of inaccessibility? So yeah, that's my speculative answer, very, I don't know, weird and philosophical. But thinking about borders, maybe I think a lot about immunology, because I do a lot of research in toxic spaces, such as the lower Mississippi River in the petrochemical corridor, also known as Cancer Alley. So I'm quite sensitive to, you know, doing research in a contaminated space, and that has really changed how I listen to ecosystems and how I think about them in an expanded sense. So how I look at this kind of symptomatology, or where does the body start or end? You know, what is this kind of relation of molecular colonialism that we live with forever chemicals every day in our bodies? So yeah, I think borders and ecosystems are this kind of, for me, this kind of space of thinking about the interscalar and how complex politics or policy or even health management is at this level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also as well, I mean, it kind of goes to show, especially like what both of you talk about, is very much that kind of like, they're not something that is just like so clean and linear, but rather there's also kind of like a space contestation around them as well. So they leak into systems, they leak into environments, and as a consequence then you're expected to perform in relation to these spaces that are not so kind of, they're more abstract, they're not kind of like clear, you're not near the border, but yet you need to kind of start to perform in a particular kind of way. And personally speaking, I'm very interested in this idea of like how kind of more and more of our kind of forms of kind of contemporary power actually is actually becoming, operates through performance, through this kind of like stage display of like security or control, or even the idea of like, you know, world leaders circulating AI slop as kind of like policy these days. That's a favorite, I think. But I guess, like, you know, in one way you have like border regimes, they produce kind of bodily behaviors, but I'm interested in also as well in how these things come inherently political as well, especially in your work as well, because you write about kind of sound as something that destabilizes, partition and fixed boundaries. So I want to like get you to talk a little bit more about how kind of sound then complicates that logic of the border itself.
So I guess part of my work started after doing a lot of mining activism, actually deep sea mining activism. My work started thinking about ocean noise, and you know, sound travels 4 to 5 times faster underwater. It's a place where it travels in many, many directions. For example, a huge oil tanker, a super tanker, can be heard 24 hours before it's seen in the horizon. So it's like a super complex sonic space where kind of the sound spectrum is, you know, resisting any form of border. So, you know, there are marine protected areas and such spaces, but there are all these things that resist any idea of fixity and destabilize any idea of partition, or, you know, really makes us think much harder about jurisdiction, you know, and legality. So I think actually sound is a very interesting way of destabilizing this idea of borders and of zoning practices, which we still do, like even in our conservation politics and so on. So for me, like sound as an investigative media has really kind of opened up the debates, you know, in a kind of cross-scalar way.
Yeah, how things get like zoned, partitioned, like, you know, organized in a way.
And how we can produce other arguments, yeah, to destabilize those
exactly.
thoughts.
I do love destabilizing the category myself. I'm actually also just kind of picking up on this idea of kind of like how things become kind of stable and unstable. In particular, I'm very interested in the types of like imagery and iconography that actually is behind that project as well. Because like, a lot of, like, even though it was like a speculative EU project, it actually became like the logic of like this speculation actually became kind of like deeply embedded within kind of like border regimes in the EU. And also, I mean, I have kind of like 2 questions. One, what drew you to that project, because it partly existed as speculation, but also I'm very interested in how the project itself draws on this mythological figure of Telos, which is like a bronze giant that protected the Crete. And I'm interested in why basically like we constantly return to the mythic or civilization narratives, especially kind of like the idea of kind of like tidy narratives around kind of borders in a way.
Yeah, so it's a kind of I can even call it a common practice to call all these problematic projects in by names of figures in the Greek mythology, like for example Neptune project, which Frontex installed in order to intercept movement in the Mediterranean. So it's almost ironic how the going back to a certain basis of European democracy and ideas of our values are actually being hijacked through through their naming, legitimizing those projects, which are highly problematic. So it's exactly where I think with this project we try to enter into a certain ideological terrain where this kind of projects try to navigate, and also they succeed, as you mentioned, not only to navigate but also to shift the system and to shift the border to how to become more and more deadly. And therefore, this dispositive, the using of the stage in the image that I showed you earlier, became a kind of the starting point of how the project looks like. So we actually try to somehow reconstruct or reenact that event that promoted this system. So you find yourself as an audience that come to the theater, you find yourself actually being promoted to this technology. So actually we try through, digging into the files that this project, released to somehow double to cite really 70% of the performance is really clear citations. Which kind of narratives and which kind of ideologies are being disseminated in order to legitimize this kind of transformations of borders.
Yeah, but this is a great tactic these days, right? Because like on one hand you have like basically a border, a line, kind of like affecting environments and bodies, like people are dying in the literal sea, and then environments are being altered. But then on the other hand, you have kind of also the border itself being contested by kind of like things like far-right narratives, where basically they say it's not enough, where the border itself becomes kind of like this place of kind of like nationalist narrative where it's like, oh, there's too much immigration or there's too much illegal immigration, and you get caught up in this idea of like media basically and narrative, like one where it facilitates the border becoming even more hard and more violent, and yet at the same time it's still being kind of like seen as like, oh, it's not enough that it exists. We need something else as well on top of that. We need an army now, basically, right? So it's a little bit of a bit of an irony. But I'm interested then maybe that we can talk a little bit about kind of like how this idea of like security is narrated then and performed, especially in your own work in Talos, and like why that mechanism itself is so important to kind of like make explicit.
Well, it's a bit of a tactic that I use sometimes in my project, which is, there is a saying, if you cannot beat them, join them. So it's a kind of provocation, but I really try to confront us with the narratives that are actually, determining these shifts and really affecting, current politics. Of course, it's also. It's also a provocation to question, to question the space of the theater. Are we really, are we really proposing an answer? Are we also part of a certain cycle? Can we question our own possibility? Because the performance built like this, that you almost start to be excited by these technologies, and this is exactly the moment where it starts to be, for me, interesting, because the tipping point is very, is very short, but you can really be excited by these technologies, and there is some kind of work that we did in terms of which kind of references, visual references, textual references we bring in order to a bit also seduce you a bit into potentially consuming this technology. So, because this is how it works, it's there is a lot of seduction. There is a lot of, especially when we speak about technology, and there is a certain fascination. It also the dispositive doubles a bit. A new iPhone that you want to consume, or a new new something technological late development. So there is this undercurrent which tries to a bit sneak into you and to check, but actually it's not so difficult to manipulate me or manipulate us collectively also into these types of transformations.
I don't know. Sometimes I feel like we're a little bit like too easily manipulated with kind of like technical narrative, unfortunately. Yeah, it was like maybe like 3 weeks ago, there was like these fuel protests in Ireland that came from kind of like this, it emerged out of kind of like a cost of living crisis that like we've been experiencing for kind of the last few years. And that just very quickly became absorbed into this like broader anti-immigration narrative about like, oh, who belonged here, who didn't belong here, and then how kind of like this idea of like stories, narratives, and also this idea of like an image being used to like it's an AI slop image being used to basically, you know, draw the lines around kind of like different forms of belonging. So who gets to cross a line and who doesn't, and who belongs inside and who belongs outside as well. And I think that I would also kind of think it's very interesting also to hear about kind of like narrative within your work, and about like how this idea of narrative produces like very particular ways of seeing and like understanding whether like migration is like something that's necessary, or if it's even like, or maybe it's something that's a threat. You have.
No, you just quoted the work without knowing that you without knowing that you, but who belongs inside and who belongs outside is really like a sentence that we have in the work. So
I did not know. But maybe as well, I mean, also narrative is something, because like, you know, it's probably something also that you have to deal with in your own work as well, especially in environment, and especially when like so many people don't even believe in climate change. Is this like a increasing concern in terms of like how you're thinking through your work, in terms of kind of being exposed to narratives around kind of how climate or how environment is produced in the media? Does that like change or alter kind of like how you feel about it?
Well, in particular with my deep sea mining work, like my advocacy work that I do outside like this kind of arts and culture thing, we usually do an exercise when we have workshops like in Brussels and so on with different NGOs of myth busting.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like I entered the National Museum of Science and Natural History in Lisbon, and there was this huge exhibition about mining the ocean, discover the new volcanoes. If you want a cell phone, we really need to go and mine. And they took like buses and buses of school kids to see this show, so I was like kind of heartbroken. And, you know, you have to myth bust all these kind of narratives that are given to you, like even, you know, lithium for the energetic transition and all of this. Like now we're facing in Portugal huge extractive economy that is wanting to mine all the forests that didn't have wildfires, basically to make new lithium mines. And, you know, agricultural communities are really under threat. So some things we do in these workshops are really like, okay, what are all the stakeholders and industries kind of narratives? And what are like the fact sheets that we can have to kind of counter them? The studies around, and how you kind of dismantle these kind of imaginaries that also invent scarcity, you know, when it's, you know, it's necessary sometimes for certain economies to invent those borders.
Yeah, I mean, that is very true. It is a very important kind of thing. This idea between like this slippery kind of blurring between kind of like fact and fiction about what is and what isn't, it's a bit much these days. I'm conscious a little bit of time, so I just wanted to start opening the floor a little bit for some questions. So maybe if you have like a question, just please put up your hand so like someone can come around with a microphone. But I also kind of wanted to ask a question, because you already brought it up, this idea of like the idea of like, oh, what forms of agency do we have around these things? Like a lot of the ways by which we think about borders, like unless we encounter them or physically see them in our day-to-day basis, we don't really think about them. They pop up in kind of our collective imaginary through media mostly, right? Where now it seems to be kind of like a growing political kind of point across nearly every country in Europe that like there is this basically huge sentiment around anti-immigration. Like earlier today, we just had like Reform voted in into kind of like this huge increase in Reform, which are basically a right-wing party in the UK who basically campaign on the idea of anti-immigration, for example. So I'm wondering, because you just talked about it, this idea of what forms of kind of agency do we have around these things? Because unfortunately, narrative is kind of increasingly a thing that we have to contest with, especially when it comes to kind of what a border is and its impact on kind of the movement, both environmentally and people-wise.
I was actually big question. I don't have solutions. Sorry, that's the spoiler. But I was in a talk with Angela Davis in Lisbon last year, packed auditorium, and the most brave 16-year-old girl made the first question because nobody dared, and she was like, how can we start, living in an abolitionist future? And she's like, you teach me. You're the hope in the future. And, I think it really has to do with, we have to imagine the societies we want to live in. We have to really fight for that in advocacy, in activism, and really propose the things that might seem impossible, but are really, really possible. We just have to pierce through the holes, Of course, with good lawyers, of course, with militancy, with collectivity, but who says that those futures that we actually want, the more just futures are not possible, I think we just have to protest a lot and steer through.
Unfortunately. If there are any questions, there doesn't seem to be a lot. But maybe as well, there's another question I wanted to ask you actually, which is, this is already a question that you're talking about, is like one possibility of kind of like the outcome of border regimes and the outcome of kind of like an increase in these kind of narratives around anti-immigration, the possibility of immobility. And I'm wondering kind of like, what can we think about both through your choreographic practice, but also through your practice of kind of like listening and durational forms of listening? Like, what type of politics can we see in this idea of immobility, if that's one potential outcome to these things? Oh no, sorry. I love to shut it down. Like, I think a lot about kind of like in your work in particular, for example, about like something that you had talked about like, immobility being imposed on people. So some people being kind of like highly visible and therefore having no immobility, and then others being able to kind of pass without friction. And that's something that's a tension within your kind of work in a little bit. So maybe you want to speak a little bit about this.
In that sense, I'm also finding myself, provoking these kind of spaces. Where I think that I don't. I look for provoking also our comfortability, in consuming this kind of, atrocities unfolding in front of our eyes, and the theater is somehow also a device, also a device in that kind of consuming regime. It's maybe more sophisticated. It's maybe more comfortable. We feel more comfortable in our chairs because we feel that we are kind of enlightened through these processes. But I'm a bit I'm a bit pessimistic in that regard. So I think a lot of times I also try to address this immobility, right? A certain apparatus of just watching, because we're all the time finding ourselves watching. Yeah. Unless, I remember this, some years ago there was the huge fire. I mean, every year now there is huge fires in Greece, but there was this moment where there was this picture of older lady screaming where behind her house was burning, and she was, and I saw it in a Facebook post saying, okay, we will probably continue to watching this until this will be us in that image. So I don't know, there is this gap that I'm trying to continuously provoke, that we cannot actually watch so comfortably. Because these regimes are reproduced continuously, and not only in politics but also in art, in the art field.
Yeah, I mean, in lots of ways you can maybe say like that what we've become kind of immobile in terms of kind of our own different forms of agency, whether political or social agency in some ways, and that one part of that is it's a consequence of like lines drawn on a map that seep into kind of like the collective consciousness in a different kind of way. I don't know. Maybe you have some more to add. No. Okay, I think maybe to maybe close out this conversation, I would ask maybe just in terms of kind of like the types of agencies that we see, do you feel like there is any type of like relation or coexistence or even resistance still possible for you in terms of like how you see kind of the idea of borders and that kind of like expanded apparatus around these things?
Do you want to start? Big question.
Yeah. I don't know. I tend to believe that that it's about maybe stepping out of one's comfort zone. And I know for some it's impossible, and for some it's inevitable. Because systems, for certain people, systems push us to be out of our comfort zone, whether we want it or not, and some have to make really an effort. So I tend to, and I think also this kind of invocations that I'm trying to do are actually trying to ask each other, how much we're implicated in these mechanisms, and if we, doesn't matter what our practice may be, doesn't matter if we are a doctor, a lawyer, working in a supermarket, what is possible? What is still possible? Because I think we're pushed through all this system. We're pushed into this kind of machines of obedience. And I know it took me a long way to step out of the machine and start to look at it a bit outside, also towards my own actions and also towards my own, privileges and my own, different positions in different contexts. To provoke a kind of self-critique.
I guess from my side, as a biology border is too complex for me to solve right now. I don't have a solution for that one. Besides really powerful activism on the ground, I will speak a bit about sonic borders, and that's something I've been, thinking over the past years as I try to develop a practice of restorative listening and looking at different spaces for more just forms of hearing, like activist agoras, places where I speak about ecological grief, about unspoken conditions of dispossession, environmental dispossession. Restorative listening also is a way of kind of weaving relations with other than humans. Often like acoustic laws, they don't account for other than human audition. And there's so much we don't know about the sensory systems, for example, of sharks or manta rays, which use electromagnetic perception to navigate through the oceans, and we're putting all these wind turbines around. So I think there's a lot of sonic literacy we need to do in order to dismantle like this kind of sonic bordering mechanisms and how they affect the others. And there has to be this kind of sensibility of this space of intermixing, as feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed speaks of the hearing as touch, hearing as a space of encounter between, the affect and the skin or the epidermis of the other. But how can we be sensitive about this space when the other sometimes is the deep sea creature that we'll never meet? How is there empathy we can develop towards the unseen, which is still chemically entangled with us? So, I think a lot about these kind of sonic cartographies as a way of dismantling partitions or speciesist relations, supremacy.
I think a lot about this question of empathy. I think a lot about this question of empathy or lack of empathy has been kind of like a huge part of kind of like, how something kind of like so innocuous in a way, like a line on a map, and then turn into this kind of like atmosphere of like no empathy, basically. So I'm just wondering about kind of is there something like empathy and listening that maybe is potentially interesting to talk about here?
Well, maybe from my side, I like this kind of situated listening, like some acousticians that I spoke to, which are kind of the main acousticians in the Gulf of Mexico, studying cetaceans, because there's no acoustic studies in the petrochemical corridor because industry doesn't allow, so nobody dares to ask funds. So these acousticians that are studying these, whales and marine mammals, they read all these like raw data files. So they read sound files all day, but they never actually listen to them. So I think there's a kind of a profundity of relation of being immersed in the fields, in the fieldwork, and being like exposed to toxicity and to noise as you think about it, as you reflect, that really develops this deeper kind of interconnection with the surroundings. So I think empathy is also not only empathy, but also a relation of continuity and also inequality, but exposure, exposure and curiosity about the difference of the other. Yeah, it's something around that.
No, but it's very true, though. I mean, this is a very nice, thing to maybe kind of think about or walk away with. Is like the difference of the other, the difference of kind of how a border can, it does kind of enclosed kind of empathy in a way that doesn't allow for difference, instead it actually kind of refuses it, basically, in some ways. So I wanted to see, basically, just check, no questions. But I wanted to thank both of our speakers here today, Margarida and Arkadi, who gave very interesting discussion there about kind of the impact of borders. Don't forget to come along to the performance tomorrow evening and the performance tonight. But thank you all for coming here as well, and see you all later.
Thank you.